All right, let's dive into one of the most fascinating, kind of backwards moments in the history of investing, all thanks to the one and only Warren Buffett. And this whole story, it doesn't start with a crisis or a stock market crash. Nope, it starts with an absolutely unbelievable, record-shattering year of success.
So, picture this, it's 1985. Warren Buffett's company, Berkshire Hathaway, just had the single best year in its entire history. I mean, its book value exploded, jumping up by a wild 48.2%. To give you some perspective, the S&P 500 had a great year too, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't even in the same ballpark. Berkshire was, for all intents and purposes, on top of the world.
But here's where it gets weird. Instead of popping champagne and taking a victory lap, Buffett does something nobody expected. He basically pours a giant bucket of ice water on the whole party. He writes this line to his shareholders, comparing this incredible gain to Halley's Comet and saying, hey, neither of these are going to be seen again in my lifetime. He was practically screaming from the rooftops, this was a fluke, people, don't get used to it.
And that right there is the paradox, isn't it? Why on earth would you sound the alarm right at the peak of your success? Any other CEO would be high-fiving everyone in sight. But Buffett, he used it as a teaching moment.
So let's unpack this thing, because the answer, which is hidden in that very same 1985 letter, is basically a masterclass in the mindset that separates the merely good investors from the absolute legends. It's all about learning to think in a completely different way.
Okay, so Buffett's first lesson. It doesn't actually start with a success story. Instead, he begins with a brutally honest autopsy of a total, complete failure, one that he finally put to rest in 1985. And this gets us to one of his most famous ideas, perfectly captured in this powerful analogy about a leaking boat. He said, look, if you find yourself in a boat that's constantly taking on water, you are way better off spending your energy finding a new boat than you are frantically trying to patch the leaks. The lesson is simple, but profound. The business you're in, that's your boat, is often way more important than how hard you're paddling.
You see, for Buffett, that leaking boat was very, very real. It was Berkshire's original business, textiles. For more than 20 years, he and his team, who were brilliant managers, by the way, poured an incredible amount of money, energy, and brain power into trying to save it. They were paddling as hard as humanly possible.
But you know what? It just didn't matter. The textile industry was a terrible business to be in. He said it was like everyone was facing this tiptoes at a parade problem. Think about it. Every single one of his competitors was making the same smart move, right? They were all investing in new machinery to cut costs. And on its own, that makes perfect sense. But when everybody does it at the same time, it just pushes prices down for the whole industry. Nobody gets a better view of the parade, and everybody's legs just get really, really tired.
And if you want to see the brutal reality of a bad business, just look at these numbers. I mean, it's just staggering. They had all this machinery that the accountant said was worth $866,000 on the books. But when they finally gave up and sold it all at auction, the net proceeds were less than zero. They literally had to pay someone to haul it away. That is what a leaking boat looks like.
Okay, lesson 2. This is the complete flip side of the coin. Because at the exact same time Buffett was wrestling with that sinking textile ship, he was also investing in an absolute rocket ship that for some bizarre reason, the rest of the market wanted nothing to do with.
So, while the textile mill was a terrible business, the Washington Post was a fantastic one. But for a little while in the mid-70s, the stock market absolutely despised it. In 1973, Buffett realized he could buy into a business he knew was worth at least $400 million at a market price that valued the whole company at just $100 million. And then, a year later, it got even cheaper.
So what was Buffett's secret sauce here? What was his big advantage? It wasn't some complicated formula or some hot tip. It was, in his own words, simply his attitude. He just focused on what the business was actually worth, its intrinsic value. And he learned to completely ignore the screaming, panic, day-to-day noise of the stock market.
This begs the question, though, right? If a phenomenal business like the Washington Post can be so obviously on sale, why do so many smart, well-paid people on Wall Street completely miss it?
Well, Buffett had a really interesting theory about this. He noticed that the so-called investment professionals, the very people who are supposed to be the rational grown-ups in the room, are often the ones who cause the craziest, most irrational market swings. And he told this brilliant little story to explain why.
It's just perfect, isn't it? It just brilliantly illustrates our deep-seated, almost primal instinct to follow the crowd. I mean, think about it. The guy who literally made up the rumor can't even resist the fear of missing out. He knows it's a lie,
but the pull of the herd is just too powerful. That, Buffett says, is what drives bubbles and crashes.
So this brings us to Buffett's final lesson from the letter, and it really ties everything together. Let's say you've done everything right, you've found a great boat, and you've had the courage to ignore the herd. Now what? How do you make sure the people actually sailing the boat are acting in your best interest as an owner?
He absolutely hated the way most companies use stock options, and he explained why with this incredibly simple analogy. Imagine you have a trustee managing your savings account. The account grows just from the interest being reinvested. It's your money doing the work. Giving that trustee a stock option is like letting him get rich off the growth of your account without him having to do anything special or risk a single dollar of his own. It just didn't make sense to him.
So at Berkshire, they did the exact opposite. They made sure that a manager's pay was tied directly to the results they could actually control. The person running See's Candies gets a huge bonus if See's has a great year, even if Berkshire's overall stock price goes down. It forces managers to think and act like real owners of their little piece of the pie.
So when you put it all together, you realize that Buffett's pessimism after his best year ever, well, it wasn't really pessimism at all. It was a masterclass disguised as a warning. It was him reminding everyone to focus on these timeless principles. Look at the business value, not the stock price. Find a strong boat instead of trying to fix a leaky one. Think for yourself, don't just follow the crowd. And reward real business results, not just a rising stock price.
And that really leaves us with the core question from that 1985 letter, a question that's probably more important today than it ever has been. In a world with constant noise and information overload, how much of our focus is on the price, the flashing numbers, the daily scoreboard, and how much is on the real underlying value, on the game itself?